So before we start talking about the nuts and bolts of research, we should probably spend some time talking about social science research ethics. And one of the things that I think is really important about social science and why ethics are so important is that all social science is about human beings. A lot of what we'll be talking about today with ethics relates to more experimental design type situations where you're interacting directly with human beings rather than more observational studies, or maybe you're going through documents that have already been created. But whenever we're working with human beings, it's important to understand that there are going to be ethical implications to what we're doing, and that includes the decisions we make about what to study, decisions we make about how we study it, and then what we do with the results. And so as we're thinking about those things over the course of the discussion today, I'd maybe encourage you to think about sort of three principles that are textbook flags for sort of guiding and organizing social science ethics. And that is beneficence, respect for subjects, and justice. Okay, so I would just basically start with this principle of don't be evil. And what I mean by that is that social science ethics is often taught as a series of anecdotes from the past. There are these sort of, great mythic stories of people who went, wildly off the tracks and caused people to sort of say, oh my gosh, that's a clear violation of ethics. That's a horrible thing to do. What we don't want to do is end up on that list of sort of, classic examples of the past. And so just because people refer to these, I'm going to briefly summarize them so they're sort of on your radar. So there's Milgram's obedience experiments, where Milgram was interested in how ordinary people could be sort of complicit in carrying out the atrocities conducted in Nazi Germany and elsewhere, and trying to understand how people could sort of seemingly abandon any sort of principle of decent human behavior. And so he created these sort of scenarios in which people would be called in, they'd be told, you're going to participate in a study that's going to help us, learn memory and improve test taking. And so we're gonna have you sit in this chair, and in the other room there's an actor. You don't know they're an actor, of course. There's a person who's strapped to a chair and attached with electrodes, and we're going to ask the person a question. And if they get it right, then great. And if they get it wrong, then your job is to press this button here attached to a dial that administers an electric shock. And if you press the button, the person in the other room screams. And on next to the button, there's a little dial that you can turn up and increase the voltage, and it reaches a point where it's like, warning, red zone, fatal, don't go here. And what Milgram found is that a good chunk of people, if you just simply say, okay, I need you to press the button now, we'll press the button. And even as you crank the voltage up, they will still press the button. And even as you crank it into the clearly fatal zone, and they press the button and the person in the other room doesn't scream, but slumps and appears to die, people will do that. A good chunk of people do that. They may express concern. They may, be clearly agitated about the whole thing. But it doesn't take a lot of coercing. In fact, Milgram instructed his folks to not coerce subjects, and said what they would do is they would simply say, the experiment requires for you to go on. And that was all it took. And Milgram, after the sort of, fatal shock had been administered, sort of thanked people and sent them home. And they went home believing that they killed somebody. And then a couple of days later, he brings them in and says, oh, okay, just so you know, this was not, you murdering somebody for the purposes of a research experiment. This was an actor, and here's what we're trying to get at. But people have looked at that and said something went really wrong there in that way that was administered. And we could talk about putting people in a situation where they believe that they're doing something horrible. We could talk about sending them home. People in subsequent years have gone back to Milgram's experiment and tried to look at sort of what happened to people who participated after the fact. And if you just talk to people, they have a very positive experience, or refer to the experience very positively. They'll say, they understand now that it was an important social scientific study, that it really did change our understanding about what it means to sort of be pressured into unethical behavior by a situation, something that we didn't really understand in a social science sense until Milgram. And people generally are positive about the study. However, folks who maybe dug a little bit deeper have noted sort of higher incidence of alcoholism and other social problems that might suggest that there was a degree of trauma associated with that experience. So people oftentimes point to Milgram's study as an example of poorly done research excellently done research that didn't pay close enough attention to the ethical considerations and therefore created potential problems. Another one of these classic stories is Humphrey's study, which was published in a book called The Tea Room Trade. Humphreys is interested in homosexual activity in the 1970s when homosexuality was so stigmatized that homosexual relationships were essentially forced to operate underground. And so Humphreys infiltrates a community that meets at a local bathhouse. And he sort of goes and meets people and interacts and is assigned the task of serving as a lookout, right? So that when the police come, his job is to sort of scream, the police are here, everybody run. And while he's sort of, in theory, watching for the police, he's actually sort of strolling through the parking lot, noting down license plates. He then goes in and looks up the addresses of the people associated with those license plates and shows up at their houses a couple days later in disguise. So clearly nobody will know who he is, and tells these people that he's administering a survey and sits down with them and their wives and children, and interviews them about family life and social dynamics and what they do. And so that's, A, sketchy that he was supposed to be standing lookout and instead was off collecting license plates. B, he's showing up under disguise and, collecting information under false pretenses. And C, when he goes to actually publish the results, he doesn't pay enough attention to anonymity, and you can drill into the data that he provides and identify specific people. And all of that is really problematic, not just because it was sort of, sloppy protection of people, but you're also studying a potentially vulnerable group. And so maybe additional attention and care needs to be paid to that. And then the last one I'll flag here at this point, and I've got a few others that'll work their way in, is Zimbardo's prison experiment. This is one where a Berkeley professor decided that he wanted to understand prison systems by randomly assigning undergraduates to the role of either prisoners or guards. And he sort of worked through with the guards a little bit about how they would dehumanize the prisoners, right? So strip away names and they have to refer themselves by numbers. The guards all sort of got uniforms and dark sunglasses. And it very quickly devolved into a very abusive situation in which the guards are becoming increasingly abusive. The prisoners are trying to break free and trying to stage a revolt. One of the participants on the prisoner side had to be removed because they essentially had a breakdown in the middle of the project. It was sort of the classic example of an abusive situation that got way out of control, all for the sake of social science. Again, the plug is pulled in Zimbardo's experiment, but it was pretty clear that it had crossed the line from something that was providing useful information on human behavior and into endangering the subjects well before the plug should have been pulled. And so people often point to that as an example of something where not enough attention was paid to the potential impact on the subjects. And that's something that we always want to keep forefront in our minds when we're thinking about social science. Okay, so a couple principles that you could maybe hold to that will help avoid finding yourselves in a sort of infamous social science study that makes its way into PowerPoint slides for research methods classes. In general, avoid surprises. And I'm saying that, but people oftentimes hear me say, no surprises, be 100% transparent. It's not entirely what I'm saying. I'm saying generally be as upfront and honest with subjects and the people you're studying as possible. It may very well be that there are situations in which you need to use deception. This is going to put you in an ethical gray area, and you need to make a calculation, right? Is the deception that I'm employing necessary for the study, unlikely to harm subjects, and going to produce good results, right? So I could think of an example where I'm asking people to answer questions and I'm trying to test basic knowledge, but really what I'm doing is I'm looking at how the spacing of the fonts maybe directs people toward wrong answers. Right? I can't really imagine a situation where if I ask people sort of fourth grade trivia level questions, but I change the spacing of the fonts, that kind of deception of telling them that they're trying to answer the question versus me really being interested in the font, that kind of deception is going to be a problem. But I could see where a situation like that would be important, right? If I tell people this is all about font sizes and spacing, they're going to pay attention to that in a way that maybe I don't want. So it's not that we can't use deception. It's that we have to sort of pause and say, okay, I am engaging in deception, right? I should be honest with people as much as I possibly can. I should tell them who I am. I should explain the study as far as I can. And if I can't give them all the details, I'll say, we're going to circle back at the end and we're going to talk this through, right? And I should also allow people to negotiate the terms of their participation, right? So if I'm not giving them full informed, information, they should be able to say, yeah, I'm actually not really thrilled about doing this. Or can I do maybe the first half? I don't want to do the second half, right? That should be something that people should feel completely comfortable saying. Particularly, we should pay attention to that if we're not giving them all of the full picture of things ahead of time. So again, right, we can use deception, but when we do use deception, we need to do that cost-benefit analysis. Are there additional potential risks to folks? Is this the Milgram situation where I'm engaging in deception and sending people home believing that they have potentially killed somebody and causing them, real distress? Or is this, I didn't want you to pay attention to font and spacing, and therefore I didn't tell you about font and spacing? Those are very different kinds of situations in terms of risk. But when you are engaging in deception, you need to be able to go to somebody else and explain that trade-off that you're making and have that trade-off make sense and be unimpeachable so that everybody would look at that and say, yeah, that seems like a reasonable way to navigate that situation, and not have people say, I don't know about that. That seems like it could be a problem. We also should pay very close attention to privacy, and that involves a couple of different pieces, right? And so if you're collecting data on people, you have an obligation to protect their anonymity, right? So referring back to Humphrey's tea room trade study, one of the things that he did wrong was not paying close enough attention to how do you protect the identity of people, right? And so if you're writing up a story about a person and there's a reasonable expectation of anonymity for that person, maybe you're changing key details about them. Maybe you're giving them a fake name. I've seen studies of sort of small town politics where they actually don't disclose the name of the town, right? They say this is a small town in this state, rather than providing the kind of details that would allow, and avoid the kind of details that would allow you to say, oh, well, clearly it's, this town, because as soon as you identify the town, you can start parsing out who are the individuals involved in the stories. So thinking about anonymity very seriously. And additionally, you should pay attention to confidentiality, right? Confidentiality is a little bit different than anonymity. Anonymity is, I can't figure out who you are based on the information I'm presenting. Confidentiality is, I keep your data private and secret and I'm not sharing it, right? And so any sort of personal information you collect about people, public opinion stuff, should be confidential, right? It should have limited access to who has access to the raw data. Folks who do have access to the raw data should have gone through some training about confidentiality and proper data management. And then it's also a good idea to remove any identifying information like names from a data set and anonymize it and replace with sort of unique IDs, right? So you can still have the name of each person associated with each record, but you have sort of your data file over here with unique IDs, and then in a separate location, you keep the unique ID name pairing of the data, right? So that you can ensure confidentiality, anonymity, so that if your data does get out and people are looking at it, people feel reasonably good that their identity is masked. I should also flag just that data protection is, a sacred responsibility, that if we as social scientists need to pay very close attention to this. And well, I won't go into additional horror stories, but if you're not paying close attention to anonymity, you're doing something wrong. Okay, so we also have the principle of do no harm. And again, this is a thing that I think probably is most relevant when we're thinking about experimental designs, right? Typically, if you're just doing a questionnaire or a survey, the risks of that are usually pretty low, unless you're doing a survey of people in an authoritarian regime where potentially that data is dangerous, of what you're collecting. Folks who oversee research and who do sort of what are called institutional review boards, and we'll talk about that at length in the next discussion, will oftentimes say that there are no studies that do not have potential for harm. There are always risks associated with a study. Those risks may be very small, they may be hard to see, but there is always some sort of risk. And so I'm not sure I buy that necessarily, but I do buy the idea that we should always pause and step back and ask the question, what are the potential risks here? What are the things that could happen to a person when they're participating in the study? And what are the unintended risks, right? What would happen if the information I'm collecting got out, right? That's something that's important to consider. But also, how could my research be used in potentially unethical ways, right? I might be collecting this data for one purpose, but once that information is out into the world, is it possible that people can link it to other information and use it for nefarious purposes? And thinking about that seriously, I think is increasingly important today, where everyone from corporations to authoritarian regimes is vacuuming up data from every possible source that they can have to build artificial intelligence learning algorithms for a variety of purposes. And so I think it's important to consider that. When we're thinking about the potential types of harm that could happen to an individual, right, we think about, psychological harm or anxiety, like might have been produced by a study like Milgram's or Zimbardo's. We could think about social stigma, right? If information gets out, right, like Humphrey's tea room trade, or embarrassment or damage to social relationships. All of that is, again, things that you want to pay attention to and think about is a potential source of harm from the research that we're conducting. It is often a good idea, particularly when you're doing any sort of experimental task, to do what's called a debrief, where you sit down with people and you talk with them about the study, about what happened. If there was any deception that was involved, you sort of bring that forward and say, well, the reason I didn't tell you about the spacing between questions is I didn't want you to pay attention to that, but really I was interested in how that was directing your attention. Allow participants to ask questions and clarify anything, like, I'm not sure why this happened, or what was that about. They should have that space to sort of work through that until they're confident that they're comfortable with everything that happened in a study or an experiment. And then you should provide contact information and follow up with folks, so that if they want to get in touch with you, if they want to ask an additional question, that's easy for them to do. And I've just flagged that this isn't just about research ethics, although that's an important part of research ethics. We want participants to feel good about the whole process and have that opportunity to feel like it was worthwhile and they understand it. But we as researchers also benefit from a debrief because participants have a unique perspective on what just happened and can oftentimes give us insights for how we can do things better, and can actually flag places where maybe things weren't as clear as we thought. And that's a potential problem that's going to, complicate our results, that not everybody was behaving the way that they might have if things had been clearer or more straightforward. And so that can be helpful to us as researchers to collect that information through a debrief. And then we could talk lastly about this principle of doing maximum good, right? So with social science, we're interested in sort of the cost benefit analysis, right? We want to minimize the harm that we do, or we want to make sure that the harm is justifiable. We also want to maximize the good that we can do with our research. And again, because research often always implies some level of risk, it's sort of incumbent on us to make sure that we're maximizing the benefits. And that can mean, just take your work seriously. Don't be sloppy or haphazard. Make sure that if you're subjecting people to risks, that you're getting the maximum out of that study that you possibly can get out of it, and you don't have to go back through and replicate a second time because you made a mistake. I am guilty of that. I was administering a survey on Amazon Turk, and I thought I had everything great, and I had a little coding error, and I lost like a third of the demographics, right? And so I had to rerun the study because I needed those demographics, which meant that the participation of the folks in the first, half was essentially worthless. I paid them for their time, but they participated in a study that couldn't be used because I was sloppy, right? That you might not think of as an unethical thing. It might be annoying and expensive, but from this perspective of do maximum good, it is a problem that shouldn't happen, and we shouldn't run people through the social science mill for no reason. We should also think about who might potentially benefit from our study and find ways to distribute our research and our work and our findings to as broad an audience as possible, right? And so in an academic world, we're oftentimes focused on publications, and they end up in journals that show up online behind paywalls and are like $30 to access an article. If that's the case, if that's your research outlet, maybe you want to think about a white paper or something that can be up that's a separate research product that summarizes findings, a blog post, maybe even as a way to put that information out there so that folks who could benefit from getting access to it can get access to it. Benefits and risks should be spread equitably. This is a fourth sort of research methods horror story, but I held it because one, it's not social science, it's medical science, and two, I think it's really this is the place to share it. One of many egregious examples of not sharing risks equitably came out of a study of syphilis that was conducted at Tuskegee University, in which doctors wanted to understand how syphilis progressed in patients and affected the brain. And so they identified a number of African-American men, I believe they were all men, at Tuskegee, at a hospital there, and identified that they had syphilis, but rather than saying, hey, you have syphilis, would you like us to prescribe you an antibiotic and take care of that for you, or would you like to participate in a study in which we watch you slowly die over the course of a decade? They didn't say that. Instead, they withheld from these men that they had syphilis and kept bringing them back for checkup month after month after month, watching as they progressed or degressed, slowly died from brain degenerating disease that could easily be treated, so that they could observe and watch the effect of that in the brain. I don't know how you could possibly square a scenario like that with the Hippocratic Oath or with any sort of balance of ethical considerations, but the fact that it was African American men that were targeted for that particular horrific atrocity sort of compounds the level of ethical malfeasance, that we're conducting a study that's clearly going to have harm for our subjects, and so we're targeting a specific group to receive that harm is a really problematic scenario. That if you're doing something that has real risks or has real harm, that should be equitably shared out across the society. So if you're testing a new treatment, you test it on a representative population rather than a particular group of people. I don't know that I have anything more to say about that, other than it comes back to principles of justice, principles of respect for subjects, and principles of beneficence. And the Tuskegee study, I think, when we look at it, really violated all three of those principles of good ethical research, and really stands out as one of the most dire research methods horror stories.